minute, for a moment.
Okay.
Okay, now it's back. Hello, this is Empowering Democracy. I'm your host, Joe Firestone. And what I have for you tonight is, I think, a wonderful article written by Scott Ritter. It's about uh, his conversion from a strong supporter, of Israel to someone who now supports the Palestinians. And I'm going to go through his article very carefully. I'm going to comment on it. It's a long article. It's going to take some time. It's also supplemented by a video, an episode of Ask the Inspector, the main feature of which was Scott actually debating someone by the name of Arkady Itkin, who's an Israeli, who I believe is living here in the United States. The debate was very interesting. Arkady was a pretty fair-minded person, so Scott, and Arkady could have a pretty good conversation about what went on there. But I'm not going to deal with that here tonight. I just refer you to it. I'm going to mainly concentrate on Scott's article. So let me get that up. I think I may have gotten the wrong thing up. Let me see. Yes, I did. So let me stop the screen and get that out. I got the YouTube show up rather than the article. So here's the article. Let me make sure you have it in the show right now. You do. The title of the article is Why I No Longer Stand with Israel and Never Will Again. It was written by Scott on October 13th. As you'll see, Scott is a very good writer. And the caption on the photograph is Israeli Bombs Pummel Gaza, October 2023. First section is called The Gates of Gaza, and it's a quote. The attackers came at dawn, quickly occupying the town. The men was separated from the women and shot. One of the attackers, opening the door of one of the homes, found an old man standing there. He shot him. Quote, he enjoyed shooting him, unquote, an eyewitness to the attack said afterwards. Soon the town was empty. The entire population of 5,000 had either been killed or expelled. Those who survived put on trucks and driven to Gaza. The empty homes were looted. Quote, we were very happy, unquote, one of the participants said afterwards. Quote, if you don't take it, someone else will. You don't feel you have to give it back. They were not coming back, unquote. Sounds like a narrative torn from the front pages of today's newspapers. I'm going to expand the type some. Sounds like a narrative from the pages of today's newspapers. One of many such stories, too many to count, describing the atrocities inflicted on the civilian populations of Israeli towns and kibbutzes that adjacent to the Hamas-controlled Gaza Strip. But it is not. Instead, it is the recollections of Yaakov Sharet, the son of Moshe Sharet, one of the fathers of Israel, a signatory to Israel's Declaration of Independence and Israel's first foreign minister and second prime minister. Yaakov Sharet was recounting the seizure of the Arab town of Beersheba in 1948 by Israeli soldiers during Israel's war of independence. Okay, and there's the video. I've left the YouTube link, to the video and the link to the article in the description. As a young soldier serving in the Negev Desert in 1946, Sharet was appointed the Mukhtar, or chief, of one of 11 teams of soldiers, part of the secret, quote, 11 points plan, unquote, designed to establish Jewish outposts in the Negev Desert that would serve as a strategic foothold in the region when the anticipated war between Israeli Zionists and Arabs broke out. That included both, of course, some of the Palestinian Arabs who were in what later became Israel, but also the Arab nations that were expected to intervene and did intervene and fought the Israeli settlers who were looking to establish the Israeli state and who had declared the independence of Israel. Zionism, as it existed before 1948, was a movement for the reestablishment of a Jewish nation on the territory of biblical Israel. It was established as a political movement, Zionist organization, in 1897 under the leadership of Theodor Herzl. Herzl died in 1904, and the Zionist organization was later taken over by Chaim Weizmann as a reward for pushing the adoption of the Balfour Declaration, which committed the British government to the creation of a Jewish state in Palestine. Weizmann remained as the head of the Zionist organization until the establishment of Israel in 1948, after which he was elected Israel's first president. The role of president in Israel, I should add to this article, is mostly ceremonial. It's the prime minister who has the real power to get things done. In 1946, a United Nations partition plan dividing the British Palestinian mandate into Arab and Jewish sections had apportioned the Negev region to the Arabs. The Zionist leaders of the future state of Israel, led by David Ben-Gurion, Moshe Sharet, and others dedicated to the principles of Zionism, devised the, quote, 11 points plan, unquote, as a means to alter the status quo then in existence in the Negev, where 500 Jews in 3 outposts lived among 250,000 Arabs residing in 247 villages and towns. The 11 new outposts would boost the Israeli presence in the Negev, creating the condition where, as Palestinian historian Walid Khalidi noted, quote, an indigenous majority living on their ancestral soil, unquote, would be, quote, converted overnight into a minority under alien rule, unquote. On the night of October 5th, 1946, just after Yom Kippur, Yaakov led his team into the Negev. Quote, I remember when we found our piece of land on the top of a barren hill, unquote, Yaakov recounted. Quote, it was still dark, but we managed to bang in the posts, and soon we were inside our fence. At first light, trucks came with prefabricated barracks. It was quite a feat. We worked like devils, unquote. When Yaakov was part of the Zionist youth movement, he would travel throughout the Negev on foot, familiarizing himself with the villages, the Arab villages, and learning their Hebrew names as they existed in the Bible. Next to Yaakov's hilltop settlement, which became the Hatzarim kibbutz, was an Arab village named Abu Yahia. One of the missions given the kibbutzniks of Hatzarim was to collect intelligence on the local Arabs that would be used by Israeli military planners who were at the time preparing for the large-scale expulsion of the Arabs from the Negev. The Arabs of Abu Yahia provided Yaakov and his fellow Zionists with fresh water and would often guard the property of the kibbutz while the men were away on work. There was an understanding between the leaders of Abu Yahia and the Hatzarim kibbutz that they would be allowed to remain once Israel took control of the Negev. Instead, when the war came, the kibbutzniks from Hatzarim turned on their Arab neighbors, killing them and driving the survivors away from their homes forever. Most of the survivors ended up living in Gaza. The slaughter and physical eradication of the village of Abu Yahia, the town of Beersheba, and the 245 other towns and villages in the Negev by Israeli settlers and soldiers has gone down in history as the Nakba, or, quote, catastrophe, unquote. I may differ a bit on this construction because there were a lot of expulsions of Arabs from their villages in the northern part of Israel as well, and some in the central part, of Israel. And there were major atrocities in the villages of Tantura, and also the village of Deir Yassin. Those were in the northern part of Israel, and the inhabitants of those villages were either exterminated or chased out. The Palestinians, going on with Scott's article, the Palestinians, when speaking of the Nakba, do not only address the events of 1948, but everything that has transpired since then in the name of the post-1948 sustainment, expansion, and defense of Zionism that defines the modern-day Israel. Israelis do not talk about the Nakba, instead referring to the events of 1948 as their, quote, war, of independence, unquote. Quote, silence on the Nakba, unquote. One contemporary scholar on the subject has observed, quote, is also part of everyday life in Israel. And here's a photo of the refugees, the Palestinians, fleeing from their lives from Israeli soldiers and settlers in 1948. After the establishment of the Jewish state of Israel, a group of Jewish settlers approached Prime Minister David Ben-Gurion, requesting that the men from their settlements be allowed to serve in the military as a group. The result was the creation of the Nahal program, which combined military service with agricultural work. The Nahal forces would form a garrison, which would then be transformed into a kibbutz, which would serve as the first line of defense against any future Arab attack on Israel. In 1951, the very first of these Nahal settlements, specifically Naleim Mul Aza, was established on the border with the Gaza Strip. More followed as the Nahal Project sought to surround Gaza with these fortress settlements. In 1953, Naleim Mul Aza made its transition from a military outpost to a civilian kibbutz and was renamed Nahal Oz. One of the first settlers in Nahal Oz was a man named Roy Rutenberg. At the age of 13, he served as a messenger boy during the 1948 War of Independence. When he turned 18 in 1953, he enlisted in the IDF and then went on to get his commission. His first job as an officer was to serve as the security officer for Nahal Oz. He was married, and in 1956 was the proud father of an infant son. On April 18, 1956, Roy was ambushed by Arabs who killed him and took his body into Gaza. His body was returned after the UN intervened, and he was buried the next day on April 19th. Roy's death had enraged the Israeli nation, and thousands gathered for his funeral service. And there's a picture of Moshe Dayan, the Israeli chief of staff, reading the eulogy for Roy Rotenberg, April 19th, 1956. Here, is the eulogy. Specifically, Moshe Dayan, the Israeli chief of staff, was in attendance and delivered a eulogy which had gone down in Israeli history as one of the defining speeches of the nation. Quote, early yesterday morning, Dayan began, his voice carrying over the crowd of mourners. Quote, Roy was murdered. The quiet of the spring morning dazzled him, and he did not see those waiting in ambush for him in the furrow. I inadvertently scrolled down on this. Oh, I'm sorry. He did not see those waiting in ambush for him at the edge of the furrow. Unquote. Don't take the call. Or take it. I'm taking another room then. Let us not cast the blame on the murderers today. Why should we declare their burning hatred for us? For 8 years, they have been sitting Okay, excuse me a second, everybody. Hey, John, I'm right in the middle of a stream. Call you later, bye. I'll start at the beginning. Let us not cast the blame on the murderers today. So Diane is saying, let us not blame the murderers. Why should we declare their burning hatred for us? For 8 years, they have been sitting in the refugee camps in Gaza, and before their eyes, we have been transforming the lands and the villages where they and their fathers dwelt into our estate. It is not among the Arabs in Gaza, but in our own midst, that we must seek Roy's blood. How did we shut our eyes and refuse to look squarely at our fate and see in all its brutality the destiny of our generation? Have we forgotten that this group of young people dwelling at Nahal Oz is bearing the heavy gates of Gaza on its shoulders? That's a solution. That is an allusion to Samson, in the Bible, who lifted the heavy gates of Gaza onto his shoulders. Beyond the furrow of the border, the sea of hatred and desire for revenge is swelling, awaiting the day when serenity will dull our path, for the day when we will heed the ambassadors uh, of a malevolent hypocrisy who call upon us to lay down our arms. Roy's blood is crying out to us, and only to us, from his torn body. Although we have sworn 1,000-fold that our blood shall not flow in vain, yesterday again we were tempted, we listened, we believed. We will make our reckoning with ourselves today. We are a generation that settles the land, and without the steel helmet and the cannon's maw, we will not be able to plant a tree and build a home. Let us not be deterred from seeing the loathing that is inflaming and filling the lives of the hundreds of thousands of Arabs who lived around us. Let us not avert our eyes lest our arms should weaken. This is the fate of our generation. This is our life's choice, to be prepared and armed, strong and determined, lest the sword be stricken from our fist and our lives cut down. The young Roy who left Tel Aviv to build his home at the gates of Gaza, to be a wall for us, was blinded by the light in his heart, and he did not see the flash of the sword. The yearning for peace deafened his ears, and did he not hear the voice of murder waiting in ambush. The gates of Gaza weighed too heavily on his shoulders and overcame him. Now, this is Scott commenting on the quote. The speech is notable for its open recognition of the hatred of Israel on the part of the Palestinians imprisoned in Gaza, as well as the source of their hatred and understanding regarding the legitimacy of the Palestinian emotions. So that, quote, it is so honest in that sense. But it is also unapologetic about the righteousness of the Israeli cause, regardless of the legitimacy of the Palestinian cause. Israel, Dayan said, cannot be settled without the, quote, steel helmet and the cannon's maw, unquote. War, he said, was Israel's, quote, life choice, unquote, and as such, Israel was condemned to a life of militarized diligence, quote, lest the sword be stricken from our fist and our lives cut down, unquote. As people reflect on the violence which took place on October 7th, when hundreds of heavily armed Hamas fighters surged out of Gaza and fell upon the military outposts and kibbutzes that surrounded Gaza. They should never forget the origins and purpose of these installations, to literally pen the population of Gaza into what is in effect an open-air concentration camp, and the emotions produced among the Arab population imprisoned there. The Israelis who lived, worked, and served in these encampments bore, quote, the heavy gates of Gaza, unquote, on their shoulders, laboring under the, quote, burning hatred, unquote, of a people forced to sit in refugee camps while before their eyes the settlers in surrounding kibbutzes transformed, quote, the lands and villages where they and their fathers dwelt, unquote, into the Israeli Jewish homeland. These Israelis all grasped the sword of Zionism firmly in their hands. None among the adults who lived and worked in these encampments can be considered innocent. They were part of a system, Zionism, whose very existence and sustainment demand the brutal imprisonment and subjugation of millions of Palestinians who had their homes stolen from them 75 years ago. They lived out their, quote, fate, unquote, as Moshe Dayan called it, with all its inherent brutality. The, quote, heavy gates of Gaza, unquote, was the destiny of their generation until, like Roy Rutenberg before them, the gates weighed too heavily of their shoulders and overcame them. Okay, the next section is called Never Quit. I think, by the way, that's a beautiful way to express what has happened. Never quit. There was a time when I counted myself as a friend of Israel. I campaigned during Operation Desert Storm to prevent Iraqi Scud missiles from being launched against Israel. And from 1994 until 1998, I traveled extensively in Israel. I worked with the Israeli Defense Forces, IDF, intelligence organization, Amman, AMAN, to make sure Iraq would never again be able to threaten Israel with either Scud missiles carrying conventional, high explosive, chemical, biological, or nuclear warheads. I briefed Israeli generals, diplomats, and Palestinians. I worked long hours side by side with Israeli photographic interpreters, signals intelligence collectors, technical intelligence analysts, and human intelligence case officers as we made sure no stone was left unturned when it came to making sure all of Iraq's weapons of mass destruction capabilities were fully and verifiably accounted for. I was struck by the amazing work ethic and innate intelligence of my Israeli counterparts. I was always impressed by their integrity as they more than lived up to their promise of adhering to the mandate set forth by the United Nations Security Council when it came to the work of myself and my fellow inspectors from the UN Special Commission, that is, but known as UNSCOM, were doing, in Iraq. By the time I left UNSCOM in August of 1998, I counted myself as a genuine friend of Israel. And in parens now, there was a downside to this relationship. The FBI was investigating me for alleged violations of the Espionage Act, an investigation that did not end until after September 11, 2001, when after an interview myself and 3 FBI agents, the investigation was closed. That closes the parenthesis. I must admit to more than a little ambivalence regarding Israel growing up. I was not a natural fan. My first recollection of Israel was the Yom Kippur War in October 1973 and being mesmerized by the reports I saw on television. Later in 1976, I was similarly captured by the audacity and heroism behind the Entebbe rescue. The rescue of Israeli hostages in Nigeria, I recall correctly. Or maybe by Uganda. I'm not sure where it was, but they were terrorists who captured the plane and landed in Entebbe, and they were holding the passengers, hostages, and the Israeli commandos mounted a spectacular operation to get the hostages back, and they were quite successful at doing this. But this childhood infatuation faded when I attended college between an American Israeli roommate who had just finished his service in the IDF, and in parens, I had just finished my service in the U.S. Army and was enrolled in a Marine Corps commissioning program and could not fathom why an American citizen would or even could serve in the armed forces of another nation, close paren, and a very active on-campus Hillel, and in parens, Jewish student organization. I became offended by the zero tolerance that existed among American Jews toward Palestine and the Arab world in general. I was deeply influenced by Professor John B. Joseph, an Assyrian American historian of Middle Eastern studies, the son of refugees from the Assyrian had genocide in pre-Iran Persia. Professor Joseph was born and raised in Baghdad. The open-mindedness with which he taught courses on Arab-Israeli relationships contrasted starkly with the my way or the highway approach taken by Hillel. On one occasion in the spring of 1933, Hillel sponsored a delegation of Israeli soldiers to visit the campus, where they gave talks on the Israeli invasion and occupation of the southern part of Lebanon. I was enrolled in the Marine Corps platoon leaders course and was scheduled to be commissioned upon graduation in May 1984. A confrontation between a U.S. Marine and 3 IDF tanks in February 1983 had made headlines around the world. The tanks, commanded by an Israeli lieutenant colonel, had tried to drive through the Marine position. Captain Charles B. Johnson, the officer in charge of a Marine unit assigned to keep the Israelis from getting into Beirut, had stood in front of the tanks, telling the RDF officer that they would not be allowed to pass. When the tanks threatened to run him over, Captain Johnson drew his pistol, jumped up onto the lead Israeli tank, and said to the lieutenant colonel they would do so over his dead body. The Israelis backed down. Then there's a picture of an Israeli Centurion tank in Beirut in 1982. The standoff outside Beirut led to tensions between the U.S. and Israel, with the State Department calling in the Israeli charge d'affaires, Benjamin Netanyahu, to protest the Israeli provocation. Bad blood ensued, with the Israelis spending rumors that Captain Johnson's breath smelled of alcohol. The rumors were repeated by one of the RDF soldier ambassadors at an on-campus talk I attended. I took umbrage and rose to my feet to challenge the speaker. In a not-so-diplomatic manner, I reminded the RDF soldier that he was on U.S. soil in the presence of a U.S. Marine, and I would be damned if I were going to let him smear the reputation of a Marine Corps officer in my presence. Sensing the violence inherent in my words, I already had a reputation on campus for roughing up a fellow student who had wished John Hinckley, the would-be assassin of President Ronald Reagan, had been a better shot, close paren. The Hillel's organizers intervened and ushered the IDF soldier off the stage and off the campus. My next interaction with Israel came indirectly through Operation Desert Storm. While the mission of U.S. forces was to liberate Kuwait from the Iraqi military, the firing of modified Scud missiles into Israel by Iraq threatened to bring Israel into the conflict, an act that would have caused the coalition of nations, which consisted of numerous Arab nations who would refuse to fight on the same side as Israel, that had been so carefully cobbled together by George H.W. Bush, to fall apart. Stopping the Iraqi Scud launches became the top priority of the war, and as the resident Scud expert on General Norman Schwarzkopf's staff, I became heavily involved in this effort. As I reminded an openly hostile audience member during a 2000 presentation before a major American Jewish organization, I was putting my ass on the line for Israel when he and other American Jews were buying tickets to escape the Holy Land. After the war, I was recruited by UNSCOM to help create an independent intelligence capability in support of the UN mission in Iraq. In 1994, I proposed that UNSCOM open a secret channel with Israel to closely coordinate on intelligence issues related to the disarmament of Iraq. My proposal was approved, and I helped lead the first UNSCOM delegation sent to Israel when we met with the director of Amman, uh, the Israeli intelligence organization, and the chief of the Research and Analysis Division, also known as RAD, R-A-D, to discuss the scope and scale of UNSCOM Israeli intelligence cooperation. During my first visit to Israel in October 1994, I was introduced to an Israeli Air Force intelligence officer who became my principal interlocutor for the next 4 years. Our professional relationship was exquisite. There is no doubt that without this officer, whose energy, intellect, and experience was second to none, made the UNSCOM Israeli relationship the success it was. What struck me the most about this man, whom I came to view as a friend as well as colleague, was how much he wanted me to understand and appreciate Israel, the real Israel, not the made-for-TV propaganda show that Israel is known for when it comes to influencing foreigners like me. Yes, I was given a helicopter tour of Israel so that I could see from a bird's eye view how small and vulnerable the nation of Israel was. Yes, the helicopter landed at uh, uh, um, 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 specifically, uh, actually Masada, where I was educated on the tragedy of that period in Israeli history. Yes, I was driven up to the Golan Heights to a forward observation post where I could view Syrian army positions through a telescope. Well, this is true, but my Israeli host noted sagely that what I was really interested in was the quote, Scud Museum, unquote, where Israel had assembled the debris from all the Scud missiles that had fallen on its soil during Operation Desert Storm. This interested me because it was my mission. Falling in love with Israel was not. Gradually, my host loosened up the controls when it came to where I could go and what I could see during my time off from planning inspections. My wife visited me in Israel for a long weekend. I took her to the Dead Sea, Jerusalem, where we walked the Via Dolorosa in Jerusalem, Jesus' processional route to his crucifixion on Mount Calvary, at Nazareth, the Sea of Galilee, and the Jordan River. all places taken straight from the pages of the New Testament. My wife, a devout Georgian Orthodox Christian, was ecstatic. I, a simple historian, was deeply impressed. Quote, every stone you overturn with your foot, unquote, he told me. Quote, this land is tells a story, unquote, he told me. Quote again, this land is full, okay, of history. And here is a picture of a wall at the Via Dolorosa in Jerusalem. We soon took to discussing the history of Israel itself, starting with the neighborhood where the Israeli imagery exploitation unit I worked with was located, Sarona, also known as the German colony. We discussed the British mandate while visiting the King David Hotel in Jerusalem, the site of an infamous terrorist attack carried out by Menachem Begin, the future Nobel Prize-winning Prime Minister of Israel, who at the time of the attack in 1946 was part of the Irgun terrorist organization. Most Israelis would bristle at the notion of Begin and Irgun being labeled in such a manner. Quote, look, unquote, my host said. Quote, he was a terrorist. He had much in common with Yasser Arafat, unquote. It was this kind of honesty that made me like my host even more. We discussed the formation of Israel while visiting the Ma'uz Mol Azah, the stronghold of Gaza Museum, in the kibbutz of of Kfar Azah, and compared and contrasted the Israeli narrative regarding the birth of a nation under fire. The museum was built on the site of the Saad kibbutz, which had been destroyed by the Egyptian army in 1948, and the Palestinian Nakba, or catastrophe, regarding the forceful eviction of Palestinian families from their homes, including in the vicinity of the Kfar Aza kibbutz. This kibbutz was one targeted by Hamas on October 8, 2023, tragically lost scores of residents to the violence perpetrated by the Hamas fighters. We discussed the words of David Ben-Gurion, Israel's first president, who stated, quote, if I were an Arab leader, I would never sign an agreement with Israel. It is normal. We have taken their country. It is true God promised it to us, but how could that interest them? Our God is not theirs. There has been anti-Semitism, the Nazis, Hitler, Auschwitz, but was that their fault? They see but one thing. We have come and we have stolen their country. Why would they accept that? Unquote. Yet another quote by Ben-Gurion drove this point home. Quote, let us not ignore the truth among ourselves. Politically, we are the aggressors, and they defend themselves, unquote, he said. Quote, the country is theirs because they inhabit it, whereas we want to come here and settle down, and in their view, we want to take away from them their country, unquote. Quote, he was right, unquote, my host said of Ben-Gurion. Quote, Israel has a very difficult history. The consequences of this difficult history were existential for my host, his family, and his fellow Israelis. I was often invited to his home in a small neighborhood nestled into the hills that separate Tel Aviv from Jerusalem. There, I was treated to the kind of hospitality one would expect from someone with whom you shared a special bond. while enjoying a barbecue and listening to the music his teenage daughter had selected for our listening pleasure. My host pointed to the hills overlooking his neighborhood, where a village could be seen in the distance, the telltale minaret of a mosque revealing it as Arab. Quote, this is the quote, green line, unquote, he said, pointing to the hill. The green line represented the original border of Israel, established at its creation in 1948. After the Six-Day War in Israel, in 1967, Israel took control of the territory known as the West Bank. The Palestinians were fighting to get their land back, to return the border between Israel and Palestine to the, quote, green line, unquote. And, quote again, you're a military man, unquote, he said. And, quote again, that's the high ground. You understand the risk to my family and my neighbors if an enemy were to occupy that terrain, to put a mortar or sniper up there. We would, unquote, he said in a near whisper as if hiding his words from his wife and kids. Quote again, all die, unquote. Quote again, we need peace, unquote, my host concluded. Quote, the kind of peace that gives the Palestinians their land back and allows my family to live without fear, unquote. Like most, uh, uh, like most of the military officers, my host maintained an air of disinterest when it came to domestic politics. Once, while sitting down at a local eatery near the Serona district, my host pointed out a short, stocky man seated a few tables down. Quote, that's Ehud Barak, unquote, he said. Uh, so Barak had retired from the IDF in early 1995, finishing his career as chief of the general staff. Quote, he's now entering the world of politics, unquote, my host had noted. Quote, he now must learn to lie, unquote. While my host did not inform me of his political affiliation, nor did I ask, two things became very apparent to me. First, he admired Yitzhak Rabin, a former soldier turned politician. He said, quote, he lies just like all the others, unquote, he once observed. Quote again, but he lies in the cause of peace. I can accept that, unquote. And he absolutely despised Benjamin Netanyahu. Quote, he will be the destruction of Israel, unquote, my host warned. Quote, he only knows hate, unquote. During my many visits to Israel, the threat of terrorism was an ever-present reality. On October 19, 1994, during my first visit to Israel, a Hamas suicide bomber blew himself up on a bus located on Dizengoff Street, a busy Tel Aviv thruway, killing 22 persons. The location of the attack was within a short walking distance of my hotel. On June 24th, 1995, during my third visit to Israel, uh, yet another Hamas terrorist blew himself up on a bus in the Tel Aviv suburb of Ramat Gan, killing six. During my fourth visit on April 21st, 1995, another Hamas suicide bomber attacked a bus in Ramat Eshkol, a suburb of Jerusalem, killing five. And this is a picture of the Dizengoff bus bombing, October 19th, 1994. Looks pretty bad, pretty bad. The impact of these attacks on the Israeli people was palpable. Tears flowed freely as they mourned the dead. I recall after the 1995 attack being picked up by the IDF driver who was to take me to my appointment inside the Kriya, the IDF's headquarters campus in downtown Tel Aviv. Quote, is our meeting canceled, unquote, I asked. Quote again, no, unquote, he replied grimly. Quote, life must go on, unquote. He arrived at the building where my host maintained his office. There were several female IDF soldiers working for him. They ushered me into the waiting room and offered me tea. I noticed their eyes were red and their faces streaked with tears. Quote, shall I come back later, unquote, I asked my host when he entered the room. He called the girls back into the room. Quote, Scott wants to know if he should come back later, unquote, he said. Quote, what is your response, unquote. Quote again, if you quit, the terrorists win, unquote, one girl responded. Quote, we won't quit ever. We hope you won't as well, unquote. On November 4th, 1995, my host was driving me back from the Kiryat to my hotel. We passed the Kings of Israel Square, a large public place where political rallies were often scheduled. There was one scheduled for that night, a pro-peace rally put on by supporters of Yitzhak Rabin in support of the Oslo peace process. Rabin had met with PLO chairman Yasser Arafat in Washington, D.C. on September 28, 1995, where the two men signed the Oslo II Accords. There's a picture of Bill Clinton between Rabin and Yasser Arafat, and they're shaking hands while Bill Clinton looks on. The Hamas terrorist attacks had been designed to disrupt the Oslo peace process. Yitzhak Rabin did not falter in his determination to see the process through to fruition, despite strong domestic political pushback from his chief rival, Benjamin Netanyahu. Netanyahu had mobilized radical right-wing Jewish religious extremists to his cause. He was accusing Rabin of being removed from Jewish tradition and Jewish values. But Netanyahu's posturing went beyond simple political rhetoric and veered into political violence. In March 1994, near the town of Ra'anana, north of Tel Aviv, a protest march was organized by the right-wing religious group Bachai. Netanyahu, that's the group that was following the teachings of Rabbi Kahana from New York, somebody who was very unpopular in New York, but had acquired a following in Israel. And there are many of the Israeli extremists, today, who follow Meir Kahane. Netanyahu marched in front of the Kahane Chai protest. Behind him, a coffin was carried inscribed with the words, quote, Rabin is causing the death of Zionism, unquote. So that's the way the extremists actually looked at it, that a peace with the Palestinians would be the death of Zionism. On October 1995, the day the Israeli Knesset voted to support Oslo II, Netanyahu organized a 100,000-strong rally in opposition. Netanyahu urged the crowd on as they shouted, quote, death to Rabin, unquote. Can you imagine? It's like essentially the Republicans here Trump, let's say, organizing a 100,000 strong rally saying to the people of America, death to Joe Biden. Can you imagine that? And can you imagine that he wasn't arrested and put into jail immediately? Quote, I hear you're going out tonight with some of the guys, unquote, my host said. I had dinner plans with two young captains uh, um, uh, from RAD and their fiancés. Quote, don't come near this place, unquote, my host instructed, pointing out the Kings of Israel Square. Quote, Rabin is speaking here tonight, and there is strong likelihood of violence. He should cancel it, unquote, my host continued. Quote, too many people wish him harm, and there are too many opportunities here to do him harm, unquote. That night, just after 9:30 p.m., my two friends, their fiancés, and I had just been served our dinner. We were getting ready to enjoy our meal when the owner of the restaurant appeared before us. Quote, Yitzhak Rabin has been shot, unquote. The owner said, tears falling down her face. Quote, he has been taken to a hospital. He needs our prayers, unquote. I have to interject at this point, since many of you might not know exactly who Rabin was. Yes, he was the prime minister at that time, and he had been a politician for some time. But before being a politician, he was the chief of staff of the IDF. And he was the architect of the amazing military victory of the Israelis in 1967. Just as Moshe Dayan, from the standpoint of Israel, was the hero of 1956. Baso Rabin was the hero of 1967. He was arguably the greatest military hero that Israel ever had. Okay, anyway, quote, he has been taken to a hospital. He needs our prayers, unquote. Without a word, everyone rose from their tables and left the restaurant. No bills were paid. I was dropped off at my hotel by my dinner companions who listened to the radio, kept me informed of the breaking news. The rally attracted 100,000 people, and Rabin gave a rousing speech, quote, I always believed that most of the people want peace, unquote, he told the admiring crowd, and quote again, and are ready to take a risk for it. A right-wing religious Jew, if I recall correctly, his name was Baruch Goldstein, but that is not in the article, who believed he was acting on instructions from a rabbi to kill Rabin for betraying Israel, had pulled the trigger of the pistol that took Rabin's life. At 11:15 p.m., Yitzhak Rabin's death was announced to the Israeli nation. From my hotel, where I watched the announcement on television, I could hear the wails of women crying from the hotel rooms next to me and in the streets below. And I have to interject here that I knew that upon the assassination, of Rabin, that perhaps the last hope for peace between the Israelis and the Palestinians was gone. I knew that at that time. It was obvious to me that they had killed the peacemaker. November 5th was a national day of mourning. Israel buried their slain leader the next day, November 6th. On November 7th, my driver was in the lobby and took me to the Kiryah. My host and his soldiers were back at work. 2 days later, on November 9th, armed with intelligence that the Israelis had collected about the shipment of missile guidance and control devices from Russia to Jordan, where they were scheduled to be moved into Iraq, I crossed the Allenby Bridge, separating Israel from Jordan, where I was picked up by Jordanian security officers. That evening, I met with Ali Shukri, the chief of the King of Jordan's private office, and convinced him and the head of the Jordanian intelligence service to launch a raid of a warehouse the Israelis believed the missile components were being stored. The raid was executed, and several hundred guidance and control devices that were scheduled to be shipped to Iraq the next day were seized. Now, the next night, as I waited in the dark to cross back into Israel, I reflected on the tenacity of my Israeli hopes. They didn't quit, I thought. We didn't quit. To show the measure of the man that was my host, I recounted a story Ali Shukri told me while we were waiting for the results of the raid to come back about his father, a wealthy Palestinian from the city of Jaffa, also known as Jaffa, next to modern-day Tel Aviv. A street had been named after his father, and he asked if I could go visit it on his behalf. I told my host about the request, and without hesitation, we got into his car and explored old Jaffa. The streets had all been changed to Hebrew names, but my host approached several elderly people and asked if anyone remembered the old street names. They did, and soon we found ourselves strolling down a well-lit boulevard. Quote, I'd like to believe Yitzhak Rabin would have wanted Ali Shukri to be able to walk down this street himself. Quote, my host observed, quote, maybe even live in his family home, unquote. We kept walking down the silent street, alone in our thoughts. Next section is called The Sins of the Father. On January 5th, 1996, Israeli security forces assassinated Yahya Ayash, a Hamas operative known as, quote, the engineer, unquote. Ayash was the chief bomb designer for Hamas, and his bombs were responsible for most of the terrorist actions carried out by Hamas against Israel. Israeli security was able to get a cell phone in which a minute amount of high explosive had been placed. Upon getting Ayash to answer the phone, Israeli security set off the explosive, instantly killing the Hamas bomb maker. While Israel is normally reticent about taking responsibility for targeted assassinations of this nature, I provided with an informal briefing by my host about how they came to kill Ayash. I guess they figured I had a need to know, given the impact his bombing had on my work in Israel. The killing of Ayash triggered a violent response from Hamas. I interject here. This is the cycle of violence that has always existed since the takeover of large territories by the Israelis, who in the weeks and months that followed unleashed a campaign of terror against the Israeli people. 3 terrorist bombings, including 2 buses in Jerusalem, and one outside the Dizengoff Center in Tel Aviv, which transpired between February 25th and March 4th, killing 55 persons and wounding hundreds more, shook the nation, helping contribute to the election of Benjamin Netanyahu as prime minister in a general election held on May 29th, 1996. And I interject here, of course, that victory was facilitated by the assassination, of Yitzhak Rabin. If he had been around, to run, perhaps the attack on the engineer would never have happened, and perhaps the retaliation would never have happened, and perhaps there would have been no Netanyahu as the prime minister, of Israel. The period between Netanyahu's election and my resignation from UNSCOM in August 1998 was one filled with turmoil and change. The success of the interception operation in Jordan paved the way for an even more in-depth relationship between UNSCOM and Israel, which was facilitated by my relationship with my Israeli host. We were able to create the equivalent of an intelligence fusion cell blending imagery, exploitation, SIGINT collection, and human intelligence to create an intelligence product that helped INSCOM break open the issue of past Iraqi efforts to conceal the truth about their weapons of mass destruction programs, as well as uncover evidence of ongoing Iraqi activities linked to the Office of the Presidency, which violated Security Council resolutions regarding sanctions. Now, working relationship with Moshe Yaalon, the new head of Amman, was as strong as one could hope for, and Israel went out of its way to make sure every request for support I made was acted on. And the results were undeniable. When I started my relationship with Israeli intelligence in 1994, Iraq topped Amman's list of threats to Israel. By 1998, Iraq had dropped to fifth behind far-right domestic extremism, Iran, Hezbollah, and Hamas. This transformation had come about because of the understanding that the UNSCOM-Israeli cooperation had been able to achieve about the true capabilities of Iraq's weapons of mass destruction programs. In 1998, however, this relationship, so carefully nurtured by my host and I since our first meetings in October 1994, came to a sudden halt. Under pressure from the United States, Israel ended its intelligence relationship with UNSCOM. By 1998, the entire Amman team that had made this relationship work, from Moshe Yaalon to Yaakov Amidror to my host, had been replaced. The new team, Amos Malkin as the head of Amman, and Amos Gilad as the chief of RAD, and a new, quote, host, unquote, shut down the UNSCOM intelligence sharing operation immediately. I made one last visit to Israel in early June 1998, where I was briefed by my counterparts on the new reality. 2 months later, I resigned from UNSCOM, no longer able to carry out my mission of disarmament. That's a picture, of Amos Gilad, the chief of the Research and Analysis Division of Israeli Military Intelligence. Let's get a better look at him. He doesn't look like a friendly man, to say the least. Despite the abrupt nature surrounding the termination of my professional relationship with the Israeli government, I always maintained a soft spot in my heart for the Israeli people and, by extension, the Israeli nation. Even as I watched Amos Gilad single-handedly dismantle the results of the hard work my Israeli counterparts and I had worked so diligently undertaken, rejecting the fact-based findings that saw Iraq's threat profile diminished, and once again elevating Iraq to the status of a threat worthy of war. I didn't blame Israel as a whole, but rather the individual Israelis involved. First and foremost, the man who had taken over from Rabin as the Prime Minister of Israel, Benjamin Netanyahu. Netanyahu's incompetence as a political leader had resulted in him being voted out of office in 1999, replaced by Ehud Barak, who had apparently learned to lie to a degree sufficient to the task of being an Israeli politician. In September 2002, Netanyahu testified before the U.S. Congress about Iraq's nuclear weapons program. Even though he did so as a private citizen, his status as a former prime minister gave his words credibility they did not deserve. Quote, "There is no question whatsoever that Saddam is seeking, is working, is advancing towards the development of nuclear weapons," unquote. But Netanyahu said, and quote again, quote, "Once Saddam has nuclear weapons, the terror network will have nuclear weapons," unquote. Netanyahu's statements directly contradicted the findings that my Israeli colleagues and I had reached. Findings that were shared by the International Atomic Energy Agency, the IAEA, responsible for overseeing the dismantling of Iraq's nuclear program, that the Iraqi nuclear program had been eliminated and there was no evidence of its reconstitution. But Netanyahu's job wasn't to tell the truth about Iraq's nuclear program, but rather use the fear generated by the specter of an Iraqi nuclear weapon to justify a war with Iraq that would remove Saddam Hussein from power. Quote, "If you take out Saddam's regime, I guarantee you that it will have enormous positive reverberations on the region," unquote. Netanyahu told his receptive congressional audience. Quote, "And I think that people sitting right next door in Iran, young people and many others, will say the time of such regimes, of such despots, is gone," okay, unquote. Of course, in part due to Netanyahu himself and his success, I would say that the time of despots had only just begun. That's an editorial comment. That wasn't what Scott said. Looking back today at the horrific consequences of America's illegal invasion and occupation of Iraq at an Iranian regime firmly entrenched behind a nuclear program that is not going away, one can clearly see that Benjamin Netanyahu was wrong about everything. But that has been his modus operandi from the start, to exaggerate and lie about threats faced by Israel, to justify military action, which invariably resulted in disaster. In the years between my resignation from UNSCOM and the start of the U.S.-led invasion of Iraq, I would often travel to Washington, D.C., where I would seek out meetings with representatives and senators from both parties to educate them on the facts regarding Iraqi weapons of mass destruction. At every step of the way, I was bird-dogged by teams of operatives from the American Israeli Public Action Committee, or AIPAC. As soon as I would leave one elected official's office, the AIPAC team would slide in behind me and remind the person in question about who wrote the checks that paid for their re-election. Years later, I watched a video from 2001 where Netanyahu brags about how easily the U.S. can be controlled, to the point where he knew he could get away with openly sabotaging Rabin's greatest legacy, the Oslo Accords, knowing full well the U.S. would back down. Quote, "I was not afraid to clash with Clinton," unquote, Netanyahu bragged. Quote, "I know what America is. Okay, America is something that can easily be moved to the right direction," unquote. Okay, another editorial comment, okay, by me. It looks like that is happening again, okay, today. Joe Biden evidently visited Israel. Some say in order to give the green light to Netanyahu to go into Gaza, saying in person that whatever Israel did would be backed by the United States. At least that's what people think was going on. I can't say that's completely true. I wasn't there, but it's certainly a good possibility. Anyway, going on with Scott's article. Okay, so America went to war with Iraq because of Israel. The lies told by Netanyahu and the manipulation by Israel through its American proxy, AIPAC, of the congressional duty to the American people of responsible oversight. Lest anyone think that AIPAC was acting on its own by volition, the FBI uncovered evidence of collusion between AIPAC officials and an Israeli diplomat, Naor Gilan, regarding the transfer of classified information to Israel. Naor Gilan was my point of contact at the Israeli mission to the UN in New York. And the difference between me and AIPAC, however, was that all my contacts were approved by the UN and the CIA. AIPAC was simply freelancing as an Israeli asset. Say was furious at Israel for interfering with U.S. foreign and national security policy is an understatement. Despite this, I continue to stand with Israel. On November 13th of 2006, I spoke at Columbia University School of International Affairs. The topic was Iran's nuclear program. I opened my remarks by addressing what I call, quote, the elephant in the room, Israel, unquote. Israel, I said, was a close ally of the United States, and if push came to shove and Israel and Iran came to blows, then Israel's, quote, legitimate national security concerns, unquote, are ours and could even bring war. But my support was not unconditional. Unlike the Clinton administration, I could not be easily moved. Quote, Israel, unquote, I said, unquote, I'll quote again, is drunk with hubris, arrogance, and power. I operate off the old saying, quote, friends don't let friends drive drunk, unquote. Therefore, as a friend of Israel, I believe we have a responsibility to take the keys out of the ignition and stop the bus they are driving, because otherwise it is heading straight for a cliff, unquote. I was very concerned at the time, and Israel was in the process of repeating its actions in the lead up to the Iraq War, fabricating intelligence. Amos Gilad was by this time the Israeli, quote, intelligence and security, unquote, czar, having been moved to the position of the head of the Political and Military Affairs Bureau, and spreading a false narrative among U.S. lawmakers and international bodies such as the IAEA. But something else was gnawing at me as well. In October 1997, I was working with the Israelis on a new operation in Romania, tracking an Iraqi delegation that was tending to purchase a controlling share in a Romanian aerospace company for the purpose of acquiring ballistic missile technology in a manner which violated sanctions. The month prior, an Israeli team botched an assassination of a senior Hamas official in Amman, Jordan. The would-be assassins had poisoned their target, Khaled Mashal, but had been captured by Mashal's bodyguards before they could escape. An infuriated Jordanian king demanded that Israel provide the antidote for the poison used on Mashal in exchange for the captured Israeli agents. The matter was resolved, but at a huge embarrassment for Israel. Benjamin Netanyahu had ordered the murder of Khaled Mashal, my hosts told me. Quote, that's to be expected, unquote, I replied. Quote, is it, unquote? My host asked, do you know that Hamas was created by Israel, unquote? This floored me. I had been taken to a museum inside the Kiryat where weapons, uniforms, and other pieces of equipment that had been captured from Hamas terrorists were put on display. Hamas had committed murderous atrocities against the Israeli people during my time in Israel. I saw them as the enemy of Israel. Now I was being told that Israel had a hand in the creation of Hamas. The intent, my host told me, was to create a political divide within the Palestinian political leadership and to dilute the power and influence of Yasser Arafat's Fatah uh, uh, organization. It's usually called Fatah, of course, but I think I know the proper pronunciation is Fatah. In this, they had apparently succeeded. Oh, by the way, Fatah was the predecessor, of the PLO. In this, they had apparently succeeded, but the violent response of Hamas to the Oslo Accords had caused Israel to rethink this relationship, and soon Israel was in open war with its creation. I was prepared to write off the Israeli-Hamas nexus as a political experiment gone bad when in 2006 it looked like Israel had forgiven Hamas its violent past, working to create the conditions that helped Hamas secure a majority of seats in the Palestinian parliament. By 2007, however, the poor relations between Hamas and Fatah had broken down further, leading to a civil war between the two factions that led to the split of the Palestinian entity into two halves. One led by Fatah was located in the West Bank, while the other, led by Hamas, operated in Gaza. It later came out that this internecine conflict between Palestinians had been orchestrated by Israel to split the Palestinian political body, weaken it while providing Israel with the opportunity to improve relations with Fatah under the grounds that the enemy of my enemy is my friend. Over the course of the next decade and a half, I watched as Israel leveraged its control over Fatah and its animosity toward Hamas into a cycle of never-ending violence, which always ended up with the Palestinian cause making more compromises, which resulted in more lost territory and more lost lives. The Gaza conflicts of 2014 and 2021 were telling in their violence against the Palestinian civilians who lived there, violence which was largely ignored in the West as people grew immune to the sight of dead Palestinian children. Well, I hope people are no longer immune to that sight because we are getting a tenfold dose of dead Palestinian children this time around. That was, again, my editorial comment. In the aftermath of the October 8, 2023 Hamas attack on Israel, the muscle memory in my heart and brain told me that I must stand with Israel as it responded to this atrocity. But then I watched as Israeli generals and politicians openly advocated for war crimes on national television, calling the Palestinians, quote, animals, unquote, and openly advocating for their elimination. I watched as the Israelis lied about the nature of the Hamas attacks, turning what had been a flawless assault against a series of militarized settlements and military strongpoints that encircled the open-air concentration camp that was Gaza into a narrative of uncontrolled bloodlust, which was then fed to an unquestioning Western audience by a compliant mass media. I watched how the world rallied to the shock generated by the fiction of 40 beheaded Israeli babies while remaining silent over the real deaths of nearly 400 Palestinian children killed, no, murdered by Israeli air attacks. And I decided that I could no longer stand with Israel. I arrived late to the Palestinian cause. I was too wrapped up in the Israeli saga, too invested in the Israeli fantasy to see the forest for the trees. I was too busy hating Hamas to realize that I should instead be hating that which enabled Hamas to carry out the crimes it has committed over the past 4 decades. Simply put, I was blind to the tragedy of the Palestinian people. Today, I know that the only true victims in the Israeli saga, outside the children from every walk of life who were caught up in the tragic events foisted upon them by adults who claim to be working for a bright and shiny tomorrow but only deliver death and destruction, are the Palestinian people. That is, the only true victims are the Palestinian people. At least Israel's founding fathers were honest enough to acknowledge this. The Zionists of today lack the moral character to admit that Israel can only be built and sustained at the cost of a viable, free, and independent Palestine, that Israel will never allow such a Palestine to exist, and that if there is a Zionist Israel, there will never be an independent Palestine. The sins of the fathers are real, especially when it comes to Israel's founding fathers and the crimes they committed against the Palestinian people. But Moshe Dayan, admitted this much. So too did David uh, 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 Ben Gurion. And by the way, so did Yitzhak Rabin as well. They all admitted the crimes they committed against the Palestinian people. These were men fundamentally flawed in their ideologies and motivations, but honestly so. Benjamin Netanyahu and his fellow modern day Israeli politicians, regardless of political affiliation, have no such integrity. They are inveterate liars, men and women who will promise one thing, then do another when it comes to the future of Palestine, all the while leading Israel down the path of permanent war. I arrived late to the Palestinian cause, but now that I am here, I can say this. The best way to defeat both Hamas and Zionist Israel is to support a free and independent Palestinian state. I have never stood with Hamas, and I never will. I once stood with Israel, but I will never do so again. For 4 decades now, the Israeli Hamas collusion has run its tragic course, each side proclaiming its desire to destroy the other, and yet each side knowing the awful truth that one cannot exist without the other. The Israel Palestinian problem has become a never ending cycle of violence which feeds off the pain and suffering of the Palestinian people. It is time to bring this cycle to an end. From this moment forward, I will always stand with the people of Palestine, convinced that the only path for peace in the Middle East is one that leads through a viable Palestinian homeland, its capital firmly and forever ensconced in eastern Jerusalem. That's an important statement because you notice he doesn't say ensconced in Jerusalem. So he is not calling for the destruction of the Israeli state. He is allowing that the capital of Israel may be in the western part, of the city, rather than in the eastern part, of the city. In this way, Hamas will be disenfranchised as a terrorist organization. And he says that a legitimate Palestinian state takes away the perpetual state of conflict Hamas contributes to, a status which is justified by the pursuit of a legitimate Palestinian state that Zionist Israel will never allow to exist. A legitimate Palestinian state delegitimizes the notion of a Zionist Israeli entity, which by definition can only exist by the perpetual exploitation of the Palestinian people. Benjamin Netanyahu was able to sustain the modern day version of the Zionist Israeli state by generating fear through the endless cycle of Hamas driven violence, remove the threat posed by Hamas and Zionist Israel, no longer will be able to blind the citizens of Israel and the world to the apartheid-like reality of the present-day Israeli existence. Basic humanity will compel Zionist Israel to shed its Zionist ideology, just as apartheid South Africa shed its ugly legacy of white supremacy. Post-Zionist Israel will be compelled by necessity to learn to coexist with its non-Jewish neighbors peacefully and prosperously, not as a colonial apartheid state, but as equal partners in the experiment of life that will have collectively seized the people who call the Holy Land home. And there's a picture of a motorcyclist and his rider. Waving the Palestinian flag over Gaza. Scott continues. The words of Roger Waters' great song, The Gunner's Dream, come to mind when envisioning such a place. You can relax on both sides of the tracks, but maniacs don't blow holes in bandsmen by remote control. And everyone has recourse to the law, and no one kills the children anymore. I stand with Palestine because I want to live in a world where children are no longer plucked from bloodstained furniture strewn about the kibbutz ransacked by Hamas, the gunmen, or extracted, broken, and blackened by soot from the remains of a home pulverized by Israeli bombs. No one kills the children anymore. These lyrics may come from the gunner's dream, but they should be a permanent part of the dreams of every human being alive who claims to be holding on to a shred of humanity and compassion for their fellow human beings. I stand with Palestine because I stand for the children of Israel and Palestine, knowing full well that the only chance they have of a future where they can live together as neighbors united in peace instead of enemies united in war is for a free and independent Palestine to exist. I was obviously very moved by this article and had a hard time keeping it together. I think it's a great piece and contains a lot of truth. In the context of Scott's experiences with the Israelis and his admiration for the Israeli people, and yet his recognition of the continuing and the original and continuing sin of Zionist Israel. He had to change his loyalties from Zionist Israel to Palestine and to the need for a viable Palestinian state. Notice also, he does not call for the destruction of Israel, He calls for the ending of the bombings, for the endings of the conflict, for peace. He calls for post-Zionist Israel to be compelled by necessity to learn to coexist with its non-Jewish neighbors peacefully and prosperously, not as a colonial apartheid state, but as equal partners in the experiment of life that will have collectively seized the people who call the Holy Land home. That is what he wants. He doesn't call for support of Hamas. He doesn't call for the destruction of Israel. But he calls for the creation of a two-state solution. I have to say that will be very difficult. I personally do not see, I do not see how a viable Palestinian state can be created with the settlers there. Look at what the settlers are doing, in Israel now. Look at the way they are acting against the Palestinians. This just cannot be credited. This just cannot be tolerated. The settlers, the Israeli settlers who are living in the West Bank must go. They must be repatriated either to Israel proper, or they must be repatriated, if they wish, to the countries they came from. But it is very, very clear that if one is in support of a Palestinian state, that one then must be for the repatriation of the settlers, all 650,000, of them. If we are to have peace, that is a necessary consequence of it. It seems to me. Anyway, I will take a look at the comments. Lisa Theobald says, "Hello, Joe Firestone." And she puts the fire symbol in the middle of Firestone. And Steve Wolfbrand says, "Hello." Steve Wolfbrand says, "I'm going to bed. Good night." Elisa says, "Good night, Steve. Sorry I wasn't watching the chat. Sleep well." K. Ryan says, "Night, Steve." She says hi all, and then also night, Steve. She said hi at 10:21. So not very people saw this stream. I'm sorry they didn't. I know it was long. But I thought Scott Ritter's article was brilliant and worth reading. And FTNWO, I don't know who that is, says, "You are a good man." Peace Voter 2007 says, "This is Madeline. What an emotional evening this has been." I don't know when you first tuned in, Madeline, but I hope you watch this stream from the start, because this was a great piece by Scott documenting his journey involving the changing of his belief. It was a strong belief. His support of Israel was very strong. But as of October 8th, 2023, he just could not take it anymore. Madeline says, I will watch it from the start. Thank you, Madeline. Madeline says, I was too emotional to go from one show to the other. Now, I don't blame you, but okay, I was emotional from the first show. But when I got here and when you start, okay, to read the article, at the beginning, it isn't really quite as emotional, but it gets very emotional towards the end. Anyway, thank you all for coming. Thank you, Lisa, for coming. I hope you were able to stay for the whole thing. I think it was, okay, an important one. Yes, it was a very emotional evening. Bonnie is shaking her head. She's wrapped in a blanket, which is kind of interesting because the temperature in here is 79. But anyway, okay, I guess I'm going to say goodnight now because I have had a very emotional evening. D-Stream was very emotional too and well worth actually taking in. So thank you for coming and thank you for commenting. And April says, hi, Cuddlebug Bonnie. Hi. Except that was changed by YouTube. The original comment was, hi, could fee Bonnie. I guess it could have key bug Bonnie. But that was the type ahead, of course. What she really meant to say was, hi, Cuddlebug Bonnie. And Madeline, Peace Voter 2007, good night, Joe. And Madeline said, I understand, 1042. So, folks, I guess it's time to say good night. Kay says, night, Joe. Okay, and also, I love you all. And we love you too, Kay. We really, really do. So, good night. I'll see you tomorrow. That will be, I hope, okay, a Dump the Corruption show. Okay, I missed the neoliberalism show this week and the first of the Dump the Corruption shows. Thursday night is usual. Is usually okay the neoliberalism show, but I didn't want to postpone this Scott Ritter show until next Tuesday because it was so timely right now. I have to say, to end it all, we have to stop this Israeli march into Gaza. We have to stop the support of the United States for this. Now, there were Jews and other supporters in the streets in the last few days, marching and protesting here, okay, in the DC area. They were protesting against the planned Israeli assault, okay, on Gaza. They were urging the president, okay, to stop it. What they got for their trouble and peaceful protest was 200 arrests. But in spite of that, we have to keep up the pressure. We have to keep on going because we are about to see certainly ethnic cleansing. Certainly ethnic cleansing. But also, we may very well see genocide. Also, that may not be the end of it because those nations who do not want to see either the ethnic cleansing or the genociding, okay, of the Palestinians are coming into the fray. April Mano says, "You missed my comment about jihad. Good night, though. I love you guys. We love you too, April." So that's it. We have to do our best to stop, okay, the genocide. Just because, okay, it's genocide, but apart from that, this could well escalate to a nuclear war. I've said this before. I'm going to say it again now. I don't want you to forget it. As far as we know, the Iranians have fissile material for 6 nuclear weapons. If they go to war with Israel, they're going to produce these nuclear weapons. They have the means, okay, to deliver them. Between they and the Israelis and the rockets of Hezbollah and all the Israeli armaments, there is the potential for an explosion that will spread worldwide. We need to keep that in mind. We need to stop the next step of this escalation, which is the ethnic cleansing and the genociding of the Palestinian Arabs. And also, we have to stop the brutalizing of the West Bank Palestinians as well. The Israeli settler gangs, guarded by the IDF, are slaughtering Palestinians, torturing Palestinians. That has to immediately stop. Okay, I can go on all night with this. I've said goodbye already twice. This time it's for real. Goodbye. Thanks for coming. Don't forget, keep it going. Keep it going.